The team had everything dialed in. Practice sessions were clean, the setup was strong, everyone in the garage believed they had something special locked away for race day. And then it all went sideways in a way that nobody expected, revealing something shocking about what really happens when a championship contending team hits rock bottom. What happened next tells you everything about how the most elite sports organizations actually operate under maximum pressure. Fred Vasseur stood in front of cameras after Budapest, and what he said, or more importantly, what he didn't say, sent shockwaves through the entire Formula One paddock. Everyone was waiting for the excuses. Everyone was waiting for the blame shifting. Everyone was waiting to see if Ferrari's leadership would fracture under the weight of a catastrophic performance. Instead, something completely different happened. This is the story of Ferrari's Hungarian Grand Prix collapse, the strategy that backfired weeks earlier, the driver drama that nearly derailed the entire season, and most importantly, how one man's response to absolute chaos revealed the blueprint that separates championship-winning teams from everyone else. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand why what Vasseur did after that race matters far beyond just Ferrari, and what it tells us about where this team is really headed this season. Let's rewind to Budapest. The Hungarian Grand Prix has always been a circuit that separates the wheat from the chaff in Formula One. It's narrow, it demands precision, and it's nearly impossible to overtake, which means if you don't nail qualifying and strategy, you're going to be spending race day watching the cars in front of you instead of chasing podiums. Ferrari came into Hungary with momentum. Leclerc and Hamilton were battling for points. The championship fight was intense. The energy inside the Scuderia was focused. But here's where it gets interesting. In practice sessions, Ferrari locked in the kind of pace that makes rival teams sit up and take notice. The car was balanced, the drivers were comfortable. All the preliminary work pointed toward a race day that could yield strong results, maybe even a podium finish. The data was telling Ferrari that they had something. The engineers were happy, the drivers were happy. Everything was lining up correctly. Then came Friday night debriefs and Saturday qualifying, and somewhere in those sessions, reality shifted. The same package that felt sharp in practice suddenly felt unpredictable on track. It wasn't a dramatic crash or a mechanical failure, it was something far more insidious. The car's characteristics changed, balance disappeared. What worked in one session evaporated in the next. This is something fans don't always appreciate about Formula One. The gap between being completely confident and being completely scrambled can happen in literally 6 hours. By the time race day arrived, Ferrari was already playing damage control, and they didn't even realize how much worse it was about to get. Sunday at Budapest wasn't just a bad race. It was a cascading series of decisions, strategy calls, and mechanical moments that snowballed into complete organizational dysfunction. It wasn't one thing that went wrong, it was everything. Multiple strategic miscalculations, tire management that didn't align with the original plan, pit stop coordination that got tangled, and somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, the podium slipped away. When Vasseur spoke afterward, Ferrari's official statement was brutal in its honesty. He didn't hide behind technical jargon or corporate speak. He said Ferrari's execution was very poor. Those are fighting words in the Formula One world. Those are words that indicate a team principal isn't interested in spinning narratives or making excuses. He was calling out his own organization. He was saying clearly and directly that Ferrari didn't perform at the level required. But here's what made this moment different from the typical crisis response. Vasseur didn't just identify the problem. He immediately pivoted to something else entirely. He talked about accountability flowing both directions, not just blaming drivers or engineers, but recognizing that leadership starts at the top. He talked about the team being locked in a bubble, focused inward on solving problems rather than outward on defending themselves against criticism. This wasn't a traditional damage control press conference. This was something far more calculated and revealing. The deeper context matters here. Just weeks earlier at the Austrian Grand Prix, Ferrari had made another high-stakes strategic gamble. They'd gotten aggressive chasing Mercedes. They'd stretched resources and pushed for an outcome that was frankly unrealistic given where their car actually was that day. It backfired. Vasseur admitted afterward that they'd been chasing rather than racing, that desperation had crept into their decision-making. That was a crucial learning moment for the team, and you could sense that Vasseur took that lesson to heart. So when Budapest unfolded, Vasseur wasn't having a knee-jerk reaction. He was connecting dots. He was seeing a pattern. Ferrari had gotten too aggressive. They'd left their lane. They'd started making decisions based on hope rather than data. And he recognized that the only way to fix this wasn't through reactive changes or dramatic personnel shifts. It was through an even deeper focus on process, on fundamentals, and on forcing everyone inside that bubble to do better work. The championship fight was getting tighter. Lewis Hamilton was pushing hard. Charles Leclerc was hungry. The points gap was narrowing. Every race felt like it carried massive weight, and Ferrari, for all their resources and history and prestige, were proving that they could crumble just as easily as any other team when pressure mounted and execution faltered. This is the moment that separates organizations that have true champions running them from those that don't. While everyone was focused on the race strategy and the mechanical failures, something else was brewing inside Ferrari that Vasseur had to navigate with incredible care. Having Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc on the same team is like managing two alpha predators in the same territory. They're both fighting for wins. They're both fighting for the championship. They're both world-class talents with egos to match. And they're both operating in an environment where one mistake from the team can instantly spark conflict. Vasseur had already been managing this tension throughout the season. It wasn't loud or dramatic most of the time. Formula One teams are too professional for that. But it was there. Every pit stop, every strategy call, every moment where one driver might have benefited from a decision while the other didn't. These are the moments where championship teams either strengthen their cohesion or splinter. What made this situation unique was the timing. Coming into Budapest, both drivers had been delivering strong performances, but the pressure of the title fight was intensifying. Resources inside the team were being stretched. Every decision about resource allocation between the two cars carried implications. If you favor one driver, the other feels it. If you try to treat them equally, you end up shortchanging both. This is the fundamental tension of two-driver teams fighting for championships. After Budapest, Vasseur made an interesting move. He publicly called for discipline, not just on track, but everywhere. He made clear statements about both drivers needing to stay focused, stay composed, and avoid any drama that could distract from the team's primary mission. This wasn't him being soft. This was him being extremely firm about the fact that right now, with championship points on the line, any internal conflict was toxic. The brilliance of what Vasseur did here was that he wasn't singling anyone out. He wasn't saying Charles needs to be better or Lewis needs to focus. He was saying both of you need to understand that championship fights are won by teams, not individuals. He was drawing a line. Personal drama stops here. Everyone's energy gets pointed at one thing: closing the gap to the top teams and moving forward. This matters because Ferrari's recent history is littered with examples of internal conflict becoming a drag on performance. Driver tensions have actually cost Ferrari points and races over the years. Vasseur clearly wasn't interested in repeating that pattern. After Hungary, Vasseur established new clarity about expectations. The drivers understood that they had everything they needed from the team. The team understood that the drivers had to remain absolutely professional. It was an implicit reset. What's fascinating is how this connects back to his bubble philosophy. By focusing everyone inward on the quality of their work rather than on external criticism or rival narratives, Vasseur was essentially creating an environment where the drivers had no excuse for distraction. They couldn't blame the media, they couldn't blame rivals, they couldn't blame circumstances. They had everything they needed, and now it was about whether they could execute at the level required. The championship was far from over at this point, but the psychological dimensions of the fight were becoming clear. Teams that fell apart under pressure, that allowed internal conflict to grow, that made excuses instead of fixing problems, those teams went home empty. Teams that tightened their focus, that united around clear principles, that faced their failures directly and committed to improvements, those teams found their way back to winning. Vasseur was clearly operating from that second playbook, and by putting his drivers on notice after Hungary, by making clear that discipline and professionalism were non-negotiable, he was actually doing something far more sophisticated than just managing personalities. He was setting the tone for what the entire team needed to become in order to win championships. To fully understand what Vasseur's response to Hungary meant, you have to go back to Austria and understand how that race had already taught Ferrari some hard lessons about the dangers of desperation and strategy. The Austrian Grand Prix came earlier in the season, and Ferrari went into that race with specific objectives. They wanted to show they could compete with Mercedes at the front. They wanted podium finishes. They wanted momentum. What actually happened was Ferrari got greedy. The team made strategic decisions that were more aggressive than their actual pace justified. They were chasing outcomes that required perfect execution and luck rather than executing a strategy built on what the car was actually capable of doing. When that aggressive approach failed, and it did, it stung. More importantly, it revealed something about Ferrari's decision-making under pressure. Vasseur admitted it afterward. He said Ferrari had been chasing rather than racing. That's a profound distinction that separates elite teams from everyone else. Chasing means you're reacting to competitors, making decisions based on what others are doing, stretching beyond your capability in hopes of getting lucky. Racing means you're operating at the edge of what your team can actually do, maximizing your genuine strengths and letting performance speak for itself. The Austrian lesson was supposed to reset Ferrari's approach. Vasseur seemed determined that his team would stop chasing and start racing, stop making desperate strategic calls and start executing methodically, stop assuming they could beat better prepared rivals through aggression, and start building competitive advantages through superior preparation and execution. But here's where it gets complicated. Just a few weeks later at Budapest, Ferrari made some of those same mistakes again. Not identically, teams are smart enough to learn, but philosophically similar. They were making decisions that were stretched beyond what they should have been doing, strategic calls that weren't aligned with their actual performance level. It was almost like Austria's lesson hadn't fully taken root, or external pressure had pushed them back into old patterns. This is actually a critical insight into how championship contending teams operate. One setback doesn't automatically reprogram everyone's thinking. You need multiple data points. You need clear, consistent reinforcement of the lessons you're trying to teach. Austria should have been enough, but clearly something between Austria and Budapest caused Ferrari to regress slightly back into desperation mode. Vasseur's response after Hungary was about something deeper than just that one race. It was about establishing a new baseline for how Ferrari would make decisions for the rest of the season. No more chasing, no more desperation, no more hoping that aggressive strategies would magically work out. Instead, methodical analysis, honest assessment of what's possible, ruthless execution of what they actually could do. The team needed to rebuild confidence. They needed to prove to themselves that they could deliver clean, professional performances. They needed a win, not necessarily in points, but in the process. One race executed perfectly according to plan, even if it didn't yield a podium, would have done more for team morale than a lucky podium that masked poor execution. This is where Fred Vasseur's bubble mentality became critical. By blocking out external noise and external expectations, Ferrari could focus exclusively on the quality of their work. They didn't have to worry about what Mercedes was doing or what Red Bull was saying or what the media was predicting. They just had to get better at their job. That's actually incredibly liberating for a team in crisis. The Austrian lesson combined with the Hungarian reality forced a recalibration. Fred Vasseur was essentially saying, we can't outthink or outgamble the top teams right now, so let's outwork them instead. Let's outprepare them. Let's get our execution so clean that when we show up to a race, we can extract the maximum from what we have. That's how you get back to winning. In crisis moments, leaders reveal their true character. Fred Vasseur's response to Hungary was instructive not because of what he said loudly, but because of what he communicated through his actions and his strategic focus. He didn't panic. He didn't lash out. He didn't make dramatic changes just to appear like something was happening. Instead, he did something far more calculated and profound. First, he acknowledged the failure completely. There was no spin. There was no, well, we had some positives, or the team showed great spirit. He said execution was very poor. That's honest leadership. That's someone willing to look at a bad performance and call it exactly what it was. No sugarcoating, no corporate speak, just clarity. Second, he pivoted immediately to solutions. Fred Vasseur committed the team to deeper analysis, wind tunnel work, power unit improvements, chassis development, strategic analysis of where decisions had gone wrong. He was saying, now that we've acknowledged the problem, we're going to attack it methodically and with total focus. This isn't a moment for reflection or introspection. This is a moment for action. Third, and perhaps most importantly, he reestablished team unity as the foundation. Instead of looking outward and blaming circumstances or rivals, Fred Vasseur looked inward and demanded that everyone in the organization, from mechanics to engineers to drivers, take ownership of doing better. He said the team was locked in a bubble, and everything inside that bubble had to be focused on improvement. What made this response so powerful was that it was exactly the opposite of what a weakened leader would have done. A weakened leader would have made excuses, would have blamed drivers, would have attacked rival teams for their spending or their development pace, would have tried to deflect responsibility. Fred Vasseur did none of that. He did what great leaders do. He acknowledged reality, pointed towards solutions, and unified the team around a common purpose. The media loves it when team principals get defensive or emotional after bad races. It creates conflict, it creates narratives, it creates clicks and headlines. Fred Vasseur deliberately didn't play that game. He refused to give the media anything to work with except professionalism and a commitment to improvement, which ironically made his response far more powerful than any emotional outburst could have been. There's a psychological dimension here that's worth understanding. When a leader stays calm in crisis, it settles the entire organization. The drivers see it and think, okay, panic isn't the response here, improvement is. The engineers see it and think, we are not going to be blamed unfairly, but we are accountable for better execution. The mechanics see it and think, leadership trusts us, and now we need to prove that trust is justified. Contrast this with what happens when leaders panic. It ripples through the organization. Suddenly, everyone is defensive. Suddenly, people are protecting themselves instead of focusing on solutions. Suddenly, the team fractures into groups trying to avoid blame instead of uniting around fixing problems. Fred Vasseur's response did the exact opposite. It unified. What's also interesting is that Fred Vasseur clearly understood the difference between short-term performance pressure and long-term organizational development. Hungary was one race. It was a bad race, but it was one data point. The real work, the work that would determine Ferrari's future, was in how they responded. Would they learn the right lessons? Would they maintain discipline and focus? Would they resist the temptation to panic? His commitment to staying inside the bubble was particularly telling. In Formula One, there's constant external noise. Rival team bosses commenting on your development spending, media outlets questioning your strategy, analysts predicting your future, social media fans demanding answers. It's endless, and it's designed to distract you. Fred Vasseur was saying, we don't care about any of that right now. We care about closing our garage door, looking at what we did wrong, and doing the work to get better. That's actually a classic strategy that separates championship teams from everyone else. Mercedes built championships partly on their ability to tune out noise and focus on internal excellence. Red Bull has done the same. Ferrari historically has sometimes gotten distracted by external pressure and media narratives. Fred Vasseur seemed determined to change that pattern. The response also established something crucial for the season ahead: expectations. Fred Vasseur was saying Ferrari expected better of themselves, that this performance didn't meet their standard, that accountability flowed from the top down, not the other way around, that there were no excuses in this organization, only solutions. If you zoom out from Hungary and look at the broader implications of Fred Vasseur's response, something becomes clear. Ferrari is in the middle of a philosophical reset, not just tactically, but philosophically. Organizationally, the question isn't whether they can win races. They have incredible resources and talent. The question is whether they can build and maintain the discipline, focus, and execution standards required to win championships. Vasseur's response to Hungary suggests that he understands this fully. He's not trying to win through clever strategy or shortcuts or gambles. He's trying to build a culture where Ferrari executes at the highest level consistently, where discipline is non-negotiable, where drivers, engineers, and strategists all understand that championship teams are built on process excellence, not lucky breaks. The power unit improvements and chassis developments he committed to were important, obviously. You can't win Formula One with a slow car. But what might have been even more important was the message he was sending about how the team would operate going forward. No desperation, no chasing, no hope-based strategy. Just rigorous, disciplined, methodical work to extract maximum performance from what they had. For Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton, the message was clear. You have everything you need from this team. Now, deliver. Stop looking for external factors to blame. Stop assuming the team made mistakes that cost you points. Step up and drive at championship level. That's accountability, and it's exactly what you need in a championship fight. For the engineers and strategists, the message was equally clear. Every decision you make is being evaluated against one standard. Does this maximize our performance? Not, does this look good? Does this match what rivals are doing? Does this seem clever? Just, does this actually help us win? Strip away everything else and focus on that one question. What's becoming apparent is that Ferrari's challenge in 2026 isn't primarily mechanical or aerodynamic, it's organizational and psychological. They have the resources, they have the talent, they have the infrastructure. What they needed to develop was the discipline to execute at championship level consistently. Vasseur's response to Hungary suggests he's clearly working on that. The broader Formula One paddock was watching his response carefully. In a sport where drama is currency and conflict sells headlines, Vasseur chose something different. He chose to invest his credibility in steady, professional leadership rather than reactive emotional responses. It's a longer-term play. It's less flashy. It doesn't create headlines. But it's actually far more powerful for building championship-contending organizations. We've seen this pattern before in Formula One history. Teams that maintain discipline and focus through adversity tend to rebound strongly. Teams that panic or fracture under pressure tend to stay in crisis for longer. Vasseur was clearly trying to put Ferrari in the first category. Whether he would succeed depended on whether the entire organization would follow his lead and maintain that focus when setbacks inevitably happened again. The season stretched ahead with major points still to be contested. Ferrari wasn't out of the championship fight, not by a long shot, but they needed to prove something to themselves. They needed a clean, well-executed performance where everything went according to plan. Not necessarily a win, but a race where strategy was sound, execution was crisp, and the team functioned as a cohesive unit. That would rebuild confidence and prove that the lessons from Austria and Hungary had actually taken root. Vasseur's response to the Hungarian Grand Prix tells us something important about what separates great leaders from average ones in high-pressure situations. Great leaders don't panic. Great leaders don't make excuses. Great leaders acknowledge reality, take responsibility, refocus their organizations on core principles, and drive forward with clarity and purpose. That's what we saw. That's why it mattered, and that's why the paddock was paying close attention to where Ferrari went from there. The championship fight would be decided in the races ahead, but the foundation for Ferrari's future was being built in these moments, in how leadership responded to adversity, how teams handled pressure, and whether they could maintain the discipline and focus required to compete at the highest level. Vasseur's response suggested he understood this. Whether Ferrari could execute on his vision would determine not just their season, but their trajectory as an organization going forward.